Well, here we are again, folks. Another Tuesday evening. Welcome, welcome. Enjoying the pre-show chat, and nice to see some familiar faces on, and also some new names as well. So welcome to DFA. I'm going to put the pre-show banner on just for a moment or two, let people find their way in as normal, and then we'll get going. Of course, it's just me tonight. We're going to be talking about the RBA and their most recent discussion. We're going to talk about home prices, and we're going to talk about some of the mortgage stress and related issues. So plenty of issues, and also opportunity to ask questions, as we'll see. Just before I progress, let me give you a little bit of a view of the doggies, who are now firmly ensconced. They've had their walk, they've had their lunch, and they're now snoozing. Well, Luna's snoozing. Meteor's just having a little listen, see what's going on. She's listening, in fact, for the refuse collectors who's just moving up the street at the moment. So if you hear a bark, it'll be because of that. And this is the view of the studio as normal. Of course, I don't have anybody else on the Zoom tonight, so it's just me. But as normal, you can see there the multi-view up there, the chat over there, the program out over there, and the other screens that I use to provide information to the show. And over here, I've got the streaming computer control system. In fact, it's not streamed on computer. It's actually got, I have a custom piece of hardware that does the streaming because I don't want to be reliant on software. So far, it's not failed me. So that's always good. Anyway, I think we're good to go now. I'm going to take the pre-show off. And I'm going to start the show. I'll be back in a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream. Can you believe it's the 7th of May 2024 already? Can't believe it. I don't know where the year's gone. This is Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the stream tonight, and very pleased that you've taken some time out of your Tuesday evening to spend some time with me. It's greatly appreciated. And what we're going to do, of course, is as we normally do, walk through some of the latest information, and then we will have a chance to look at some of the questions and basically go from there, really. Make it up as we go along as normal, particularly when it's just me. So plenty to discuss. I've got loads of information at my fingertips here as well. Just before I get started, I will just remind you, if I may, that we are actually, let's go there. Yep, there we go. Just on the house rules. We don't provide specific financial or legal advice on the channel here. This is very much a question of general conversations only, but we also moderate the stream, and I do encourage you to put your questions and comments in, and I won't necessarily follow them all, but use the chat for what it's there for. But please just bear in mind that we do moderate, and please keep polite about it. We've put this in as the 7th of May, of course, if you're watching in replay. And if you'd like to get my attention, specifically to ask a question or to make sure that I see a particular comment, use @WalkTheWorld. That means that I definitely will see it coming into my queue. I won't necessarily see everybody else's conversations because there are just so many. The chat goes pretty fast when we get going. And I have enabled Super Chat, which means that if you'd like to get your question top of the queue, you can use Super Chat to do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. As I always say, I really greatly appreciate those who make a contribution to what we do. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there are some really important conversations to be had. And frankly, in the current environment with so much going on, I think it's really important to explore some of those issues in a way that perhaps the mainstream media don't. So that's what we try and do. And your support is greatly, greatly appreciated. Right, well, let's just move the conversation forward now. And my first point of departure is going to be the RBA, because, of course, the RBA released their decision. And guess what? They kept the cash rate unchanged at 4.35%. But the tenor of it was a little bit different from last time. Inflation is declining, but it's declining more slowly than expected. Wages growth appear to have peaked, but are still above the level that can be sustained given current productivity. Also, the economic outlook remains uncertain, and the process of returning inflation to target is unlikely to be smooth. And they're still shooting for the midpoint of the target of 2 to 3% by the second half of 2025. And that's no real change. But as we'll see in a second, they had to tweak a few things to make that work. And they are expecting inflation to decline. Well, we'll see about that. They went on to say that the persistence of services inflation is a key uncertainty. Household consumption has been particularly weak, and we'll look at some data on that shortly. The real incomes have stabilized and are expecting to pick up later in the year. That, of course, assumes that inflation comes off. And there are lags in the monetary policy, and there's a high level of uncertainty about the overseas outlook, and that's, of course, questions of China, US economies, etc., and also conflicts in various places. And they've got this mandate for price stability and full employment. Inflation is easing, but doing so more slowly. Path of interest rates will lead to the target returning. It remains uncertain, and the board is not ruling anything in or anything out. In other words, rates could go up, could go down, could go sideways, and they rely on the data. So basically, there is no forward guidance at all. There's no indication of strategy from the RBA, as like the Federal Reserve, as I discussed the other day. They are being highly reactive. And that highly reactive scenario basically means that we've got markets going up and down and sideways as every new piece of data comes in. If a piece of data is going to be pushing in one direction, that could be then lifting discussions about more rate rises. If the data comes in another way, rate cuts, and then it swings all over the place. So highly uncertain. And I think central banks have, to an extent, backed off from giving any guidance at all. And interestingly, of course, they take the market expectations of future rates and plug those into their models that they then actually run and produce charts out the back. So it's a completely weird system, really, where there's no separate input. It's a complete feedback. It's a fallback or feedback, I think is probably a good way of thinking about it. Now, of course, the other thing to say is that today they also released their statement on monetary policy. It's quite a long document. I had a chance to go through it. And I'll just pull out the trimmed mean inflation slide, because that's the one that's of some interest. And you can see here that the RBA has had to sort of wobble with the central forecast, the black line, through 24 and beyond, because it's not dropping down, but they're still pitching it as coming back to a similar position to what they were thinking about, which is the midpoint by 2025, 2026. But there's such a wide band here, and that's the best they can do. So there is really no forward guidance at all. And in fact, in the press conference, and I had a chance to listen to that, Michelle Bullock really just reiterated the uncertainty, did speak briefly about migration being an impact, but arguing that it was relatively small and contained. That's quite convenient, I think. And also said that more information would be coming in, and they'd make decision meeting by meeting, and things were by no means transparent. So there is a really fascinating story here of lack of clarity, and I think it's a deliberate lack of clarity. And interestingly, the stuff from the journalist Patrick Cummins said the persistence of service inflation is a key uncertainty, and resurgence of cost of living pressures will heap pressure on Jim Chalmers to limit spending and avoid adding to inflationary pressures in next Tuesday's budget. And it raises further questions about the Treasurer's planned pivot towards a big spending made in Australia growth agenda. And I think that's a really important point, because with the inflation being as sticky as it is, and with the rate being probably lower than it should be, what that essentially means is it's going to be hard to get inflation under control, and the Treasury is going to be throwing more fuel on the fire. So there's 20 billion of tax cuts coming in, and other measures to be announced. But essentially, I think we've got this really weird burnout economics, as Tarek Brooker often talks about, with one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake. Doesn't look pretty to me. Now, just in terms of not looking pretty, it's also worth remembering that, as this slide shows, the mortgage rates in Australia in real terms have actually moved a lot higher than in many other countries because of our variable rate mortgages. And that's one reason why interest rates have been held lower, because of the significant impact of variable rate mortgages. Only Norway has higher changes in mortgage rates, and the debt servicing ratio in Australia has gone through the roof. And again, the debt servicing ratio is not necessarily useful insofar that it looks across all households rather than borrowing households. So again, be careful. But nevertheless, you can see there they're shooting up because of the variable rate mortgages. And again, there is an argument to say that because we have a lot of variable rate mortgages, therefore the rates for the cash rate can be a little lower. But I don't think it's high enough at the moment. And if you think of New Zealand above 5%, the UK above 5%, the US above 5%, even their inflation is still, stronger than it should be. So no surprise that Australia inflation is still bubbling along pretty hot. Now, if we then move on to that, it's interesting that Phil Lowe actually warned of cash rates would perhaps have to rise. People hope that the peak has been reached, but it may not have yet. And I think that's the key point. And we'll have to wait and see. The next movement on interest rates could be up, could be down. We're in a position where I'm not sure and nobody's sure. And that's really the point, I guess. Now, just on that, I want to highlight Christopher Joy's recent article as well, because there is a big debate about are central banks independent or not. And Joy argues that really the US Federal Reserve and probably the Federal Reserve Bank in Australia are really very much politically influenced now. And even, knowing what's going on, they're not really acting as responsibly as they should to stamp out inflation because of the political agenda. And in fact, I made a show on that the other day saying our central bankers becoming political animals. And I think to an extent that's probably true. So maybe we're not getting a true story. Now, that said, there are some very important signs of difficulty, particularly among households. And that's where I want to take the conversation to now, because households really are under the gun. Not all households, and in fact, Michelle Bullock said that some were doing fine, they were saving, they were paying down their mortgage more than the minimum, but there are others that are actually really struggling, and of course, the proportion that are struggling are growing, and some of the recent data from the bank's results really underscored that. So I thought I'd just share that particular insight, and this is a good place to start, I think. So the ANZ actually said that the cash profit slumped, but more importantly, borrowers are falling in past due are rising. Homeowners are falling behind on mortgages, with the value of past due loans held at the ANZ rising 22% over the past year, according to the bank on Tuesday. There was a major increase in the number of loans now 60 to 89 days past due, up 63% on the 12 months to March, and loans 90-day plus have also risen 39% over the same period. And the increases across all ages categories were driven by home loans. And, he's saying that this is still less than COVID, but these movements up are pretty significant. And Westpac said some similar things. So the bank's stress exposures as a proportion of its total loans rose to 1.36% from 1.1%. They lifted provisions, and the CEO, Peter King, said that Australians were doing it tough as a result of higher interest rates and the cost of living. More customers are calling us for assistance, and we're helping those who need it. And that's an interesting observation, because we are seeing a lot of extend and pretend, a lot of people funding the bank up and trying to get interest only or loan extensions. Of course, that benefits the banks. But the point is, how long can that continue? And that's really the critical question. And in fact, Peter King also quoted here, made the point that the interest rates and inflation question is very significant. And, there's an uptick on stress, and they're talking about 18,000 customers in hardship at the moment. That's a specific program, the hardship program, to try and help people get through. Now, that isn't the extent of the support. And one of the things I want to highlight is there's a difference between those households who are on the hardship programs, which are the formal, legally enforceable programs. Quite small numbers, 18,000, still significant. But there's a much broader cohort of people who phoned up the bank and said, can I extend my loan, or can I go interest only, or can I have an interest payment holiday, and those sorts of things. Those are not really counted in the hardship programs. So they're not giving the full picture, in my view, of the degree to which everything is playing out. And that's a really important point. And if I sort of progress a little bit beyond there, it's also worth noting that in terms of mortgage market, there's still solid demand, said Mr. King. But he's also not convinced that interest rates need to be moved up, instead forecasting they'll be on hold for longer, with relief for homeowners pushed back until 2025. Now, there's two observations there. The first is that, of course, 2025 is further out, so a lot of people in my surveys are actually banking on more recent rate cuts. So it's going to be a problem. And of course, the banks are continuing to talk their book. And I note that CBA has always been at the bottom of the pack in terms of forecasting rate movements, particularly higher. But now CBA has kicked the rate cuts out a little bit further than previously. And this took me into an interesting conversation point shown here, where I made the show the other day saying, as more households are crushed, bankers talk their own book. And they're talking about easing mortgage lending rules. So both CBA and ANZ have suggested that we should actually be looking to ease the lending rules to try and help more people effectively get bigger loans, and particularly around refinancing. I think that's disastrous. And as I showed in that earlier show, there is very significant rises of people calling debt helplines. And we're going to see more of it. So rather than actually easing the mortgage lending rules, we should make quite sure that the current responsible lending obligations are actually being enforced. Now, if we then look more broadly at what's happening with regards to the data, this was actually quite significant. This is the retail turnover data that came out today. And you can see there that the retail turnover in volume terms is down, but more significantly, the retail turnover per capita in volume terms is even down further. And of course, we've had strong migration. So, overall retail is still down, but per capita, we're spending a lot less. And again, thanks to Cookie Boy for all the slides. And this was one that really caught my eye. If we hadn't had such high immigration, housing would have been cheaper than it is at the moment, possibly quite significantly cheaper. And this is the point. The migration factor is the thing that's propping property prices up despite high interest rates. And this is a very unusual situation, because normally what you'd expect to happen is that when rates are lifted, then prices ease off and fall. But the fact is, we've had such strong migration, 660,000 coming into Australia over the last 12 months, many of whom with cash or facilities to borrow, and many of whom are buying straight away. And so they're supporting the purchasing sector of the market, but also, of course, the rental sector with significant demand and their high rental stress, as we'll see in a second. So this is a very significant issue. This article also made the point that it isn't just Australia. This is actually a global phenomenon, particularly over in many Western countries, where a lot of people are looking to try and get out of, war-torn parts of the world to more prosperous parts of the world, but in so doing, they're actually warping the economy. And interestingly, the ABS published some data quite recently showing the migration regions. This is actually based on the SA2s, and you can see there that the highest areas were actually things like Melbourne West, Rockbank and Mount Cotterill, or Box Hill and Nelson in Sydney, in the Balcombe Hills and Hawkesbury area, or the Blacktown area of Sydney, including Marsden Park. Now, some of those names should ring a bell, because those are where we're seeing high levels of stress. And one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of stress in areas where there's a lot of migration. So new migrants are coming in and buying and then getting into difficulty. So we're seeing that quite consistently. And I think we're going to see more of it. And I'm incorporating some of the migration data into my modelling, which is one of the reasons why I'm modelling the stress the way I'm modelling at the moment. Now, the factor to bear in mind is that home prices, though, are still rising. This is the prop track data. Now, you can take all of this data with a big pinch of salt, but nevertheless, you can see there that Perth is leading the charge, up 20% over the last 12 months, whereas Hobart is down 1.9% over the last 12 months, and Melbourne is just over 1.1% higher. And if you look at the trends, you can see that we are seeing after a significant rise, a bit of a tailing off. And I think we're going to see more of a fall ahead, because I think that now this pressure on households, the higher interest rates for longer, are beginning to take a toll. And here is the more detailed information again from PropTrack, which shows that over the last month, prices fell on average in Melbourne and across the rest of Victoria, and in Hobart down 0.24%, and in the rest of NT. But on the other hand, prices rose in Perth, right at the top of the list, up 0.83, and elsewhere too. Some of the smaller centres like Adelaide are quite strong, but in Sydney up 0.25%, and as I said, Melbourne down 0.1%, and Brisbane up 0.23%. So we are, I think, at a bit of a turning point. And on that turning point, just note this, the lending commitments were pretty strong again. Investors were actually, stronger than owner-occupiers, which is not good. But worth also noting that the refinancing was predominantly to a variable at the moment, so very little fixed refinancing. Not surprised, really. Nobody wants to lock into the high rates that are there at the moment, with an expectation of rates cutting, maybe, maybe not. And then you've got this other data, which I think is really significant, which is if you look at the real costs. So this is now called the employee LCI. They're the cost of living indices. And for employees, so people who are actually employed rather than actually running their own business, those sorts of things, or who are retired. And the average was about 6%. Now, let me just make this point. That 6% includes both borrowers and people who are not borrowing. And that's a really important point, because those with borrowing commitments have seen a massive rise, as this data shows, with the cost of living index for mortgage interest charges up 173%, according to recent data as showed by IFM. And whilst the standard rate, mortgage rate, has risen, the percentage increased on households is massive. So that's why this is a really important conversation about trying to get to what it is that's really driving the markets. And that'll take me now into the second part of this conversation. So we've done the sort of the broader macroeconomic picture and some of the data. Now I want to talk briefly about my mortgage stress information and show you some of the latest data. And then the third part of the show, we'll get into some detailed postcode level analysis, if you like. I've got a couple of postcodes already people have asked for. I'm sure we'll get some more too. So we can look at some of the impact on the ground. The reason this is important is because these average information, sort of high-level information sets that everybody quotes, are meaningless. So the price indices are meaningless. So units and houses are going in different directions. Prices are moving quite differently in different locations as well. And so I'm afraid that the high-level spruiking that's going on, particularly from some of the indice providers, as well as some of the other journalists, are actually not getting into the granularity that's required, which is what I try to do with my modelling. And on that modelling, just to remind you that the models are actually based off my core market model. We survey households on a continuous basis, 52,000, and that's an annual sample. So that's a 0.5% sample. We update it each month. And that allows us then to slice and dice the data and look at it all different ways, and look at the different types of households, as well as locations, and also the other factors that are actually influencing what's going on. And then we can also look at not only the current state of play, but also run some scenarios ahead. The scenarios are, of course, not forecasts, and they are showing you some of the sensitivities that we see. And if we take things like the mortgage stress data, the price trajectory and information, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, the CPI data and other economic data at a granular level, buying it into the core market model with our scenarios, we can then at a postcode level, region, state and all Australian level, form some views as to what may happen ahead. And that's what we try to share in these shows, because we think it's pretty important for this information to alert people to some of the realities of what's going on at the moment. And I will just make the point, if you want a more detailed conversation about a particular suburb, I do run a one-to-one service. The one-to-one service is not financial advice. It is, though, looking at my data and looking at some of the underlying trends. I can look at the stress, the home price data, and also some of the other information too, based on my modelling. And it takes an hour for a chat, either by phone or Zoom. There is a cost involved because there's quite a lot of work to do to put it all together. And if you are interested in having a more direct conversation with me about a particular suburb, then you can contact me via the DFA blog, links below. Spaces are limited. I'm booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment simply because there's so much demand. But if you are interested in that, then feel free to reach for me. Now, let's talk briefly about stress, because the definition of stress is really quite important. And I get really frustrated when people keep talking about, 30% of income. That is a really bad measure of stress. Why? Because some people on some incomes can definitely afford 30% or 40% of their income going on their mortgage, particularly if you're more affluent. But other people really struggling at 30%. So I don't look at it that way. I look at it in a very different way. I look at it in cash flow terms, money in, money out, because I think that's the most effective way of trying to get to what's really going on. So, as I often say, if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items and income, then we're there to find them as stressed. If they have the mortgage, they're mortgage stress. If they're renting, they're in rental stress. Investors with cash flow pressures are identified as stressed investors, and we can aggregate up to look at total financial stress. And we look at it as a percentage of households and count, but I do focus on count. The reason for that is the rule of big numbers. Essentially, we want to see where the big numbers of people in difficulty are, because that's going to have a broader economic impact rather than a very small count in a particular small postcode, which, whilst it's really important for those households, economically speaking, it doesn't have so much of an impact. Now, in terms of trying to get to understand what's going on with stress, the RBA kindly put out this little chart, which I keep putting up, the spectrum of household financial stress. So you've got budget pressures over on one side, and missing payments in the middle, and then insolvencies on the other side. And the point I want to make is that the mild end, the input side of the hopper, is actually the part I look at. So this is where we see where the household pressure is. And I'm not alone. If you look at Roy Morgan recently published this information to say there's 1.5 million households in difficulty at the moment. Based on their definitions, they use a slightly different one, slightly more underwriting orientated. But they're saying that the stress level in March is similar to the mortgage holders at risk back in December, about 30% of households in difficulty. Now, my definition takes us to a slightly different view of the world. So if I look at it firstly in rental stress terms, there are about 74.65%, say 75% of households in the rental market who are struggling with cash flows. That's as high as it's been and has been horribly accelerating recently, as you can see there from that chart. In addition, the mortgage stress is just over 50% now, 50.1. So just over half of borrowing mortgages are actually, half of households who are borrowing with a mortgage have mortgage stress, 50.1. And that's as hard as it's been. As you can see there, it's a real problem. And comparing it with the pre-COVID 32.9%, there's quite a rise. And by the way, the latest on the debt to income ratio from the RBA shows it's 185.3. They keep readjusting it, but you can see it's still high. But as I've often said, that information doesn't really give you a very good view because the truth is that it covers all households and small businesses rather than just those borrowing. So it doesn't give you a very good, accurate view. The debt to income ratio on average for many households is above 6, and for a lot of new loans is 6 and 7 and even 8 still. Now, another way to look at this is the rental sector, and I do focus on rents because I think it's pretty important. And in fact, this report, again from Cookie, thank you very much for throwing this one up, they show that 3/4 of Victorian rental owners, so in other words, renters in Victoria, are actually in difficulty. And the score is awful, basically. And interestingly, if I look at my data, and this is the data I put up each time, if you go into Victoria and look at the rental stress, I have 74.43% of rentals in Victoria in rental stress. So there's a correlation between that as well. So in other words, my data is not so outlandish compared with, the survey I've just shown you, or indeed Roy Morgan. And looking at the data briefly, you can see that mortgage stress is at 50.09. That translates to 1.8 million households. So I've got 1.8. Roy Morgan said 1.5. Well, we'll split the difference perhaps, but I'm measuring it slightly differently to them. Rental stress at 74.65% is 2.3 million households. That's just disastrous. That is a real big pressure. Overall, the investor stress is at 23%, 672,000 investors struggling with their investment property. And overall financial stress, which is the aggregate measure, 49%, which is 4.7 million households in difficulty in cash flow terms out of 9.7 million. Now, the point there is, of course, that more than half are doing it fine. More than half have no issues. Many of those have no mortgages. Many of those are paying back more if they've got the ability to do that. Others, of course, are living in a situation where they've got significant cash flow and are spending. And that's one of the pressures that I think we should be reflecting on, the fact that not all households are in the same boats. There are some in difficulty, there are some not. The trouble is that now we're starting to see coming through from the banks stronger indications of delinquencies and defaults and those things. So they're bubbling away below the surface. And the question is, how will they develop over the next little while? Now, if I go forward to the next slide, those who've been on the show before will know that I break out the segments as well. And the yellow are the hot spots. Young growing families, nearly 90% in financial pressure with a mortgage. That's horrendous. That's about 280,000 young growing families. On the other hand, if you look at the rental stress, in fact, the multicultural establishment, the first generation migrants, 84% in difficulty. That's quite high as well. The stressed investors, the highest are actually young affluents, so those who've actually got into the investment game relatively recently, but with a degree of affluence, quite often buying the wrong properties. And overall, it's worth noting that exclusive professionals who also have lots of investment properties have some pressure as well. And overall, the financial stress, which is the aggregate, young growing families take the biscuit in terms of the degree of pressure on them. First-time buyers, of course, among them, as well as those in the rental sector. And there are other, like the battling urban, the disadvantaged fringe are also in difficulty, as well as the first-generation migrants of 57%. So it's quite broadly spread. And I will just highlight the young affluents are also up there too. And that's partly driven by very high rental stress, because quite often they are living closer into the city and paying huge rents, or indeed have investment properties that are not performing very well. Quickly go on and just give you the headline news. I won't go through this in detail, but you can pause if you want to look at it later. So Liverpool, Campbelltown, Toowoomba and Wanneroo are the top 4 or 5. Then we go into places like Roxburgh Park and Narre Warren and Pakenham and Berwick and Cranbourne. Whole host there of high growth suburbs in and around Dandenong in Victoria, back to New South Wales like Camden and places like Marsden Park. You may remember I mentioned Marsden Park earlier on. There's high migration. And Ballarat, and then Hoppers Crossing and Tarneet in Victoria, and then Point Cook and Werribee in Victoria too. So they're the top stress. And I look at it in terms of count, and you can see that 11,000 or more in particular postcodes. If we look in the rental stress, a bit of a similar story, with Melbourne being the highest area of Melbourne, high of rental stress, then Liverpool, Toowoomba, and then Southport and Labrador up in Queensland, and Westmead and Wentworthville in Sydney, and then Hoppers Crossing and Tarneet again, and Coomera in Queensland, Campbelltown, Derrimont, Point Cook, Zetland, Lethbridge Park, and then Queensland, including Cedar Creek and Yatala and places like that. And Parramatta over in New South Wales, Ipswich, Bundaberg, and then Blacktown and Gosford just slipping off the bottom there. So that's the high rental stress counts. 14,000 being the record numbers that we're seeing in Melbourne and around Liverpool. In terms of stressed investors, well, New South Wales, like Greenwich and St Leonard's and Crow's Nest, are actually right up there. Then the centre of Melbourne, not surprisingly given what we saw with rental stress. Then Campbelltown, Westmead, Labrador and Southport, Southport, North Coogee and Western Australia, Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst, Kingsbury, Matraville, Belmont Hills, Cranbourne, Hornsby, DY, and so it goes on. And then finally, financial stress. So the postcode with the highest aggregate financial stress is Toowoomba postcode 4350 up in Queensland, with Financial stress at 58% or 27,000 households. Then we go to Liverpool, then to Campbelltown, then to Tarnet Hoppers Crossing in Victoria, Derrimont, centre of Melbourne, Cranbourne, Westmead, Roxburgh Park, Lethbridge Park, Ballarat, Springfield, Labrador, and Southport, and Ipswich, Coomera, Blacktown, and so it goes on. And I'll just make the point, some of these regional areas like Tamworth is on the list. So it's not just the centre of town, it's not just CBDs, it's quite broadly spread. And if you look at it across the board, as we'll see in a second with some of the maps, the pressure is significant, really significant, but broadly spread. Now, I will just touch on defaults. This is a prediction or an estimate based on the current trajectory. And so Cranbourne in Victoria, Armidale in Western Australia, Mandurah, places like that on the south part of the Western Australian coast are up there too. And then Hoppers Crossing and Tarnet, Roxburgh Park, and so it goes on, Hammond Park and Success, Gosford, Bundaberg, Wanneroo, Toowoomba, Point Cook and Derrimut. So you see the same names coming up. Mackay's there as well, and Coomera's there. So we're starting to see now a bit of a correlation. But interestingly, a lot of the pressure is in WA. And that's significant because it means that it reflects what was happening some time ago. And the point I want to make is that the default journey can take quite a few years. It doesn't necessarily happen in just a week or two or a month or two. And the more it goes on, of course, the more it trips people up. Now, if we then move on to talk briefly about our scenarios, the scenarios are just ways of exploring futures. I keep saying this is not a forecast. This is just some sensitivities. And I have 3 scenarios. You'll be familiar with these. I haven't changed them this time around. The Goldilocks zone, which is rates stay where they are. Inflation eases a bit ahead of what the RBA says. Wages rise a bit faster. We don't get a recession and migration stays above average. On the other hand, the soft landing is that we see rates sticking at 4.35%. Inflation falls, but then comes back up a bit and a bit later, stays above target until the RBA's 2025, but we don't get a recession and migration starts to fall a bit. But the worst case, the nightmare scenario is you see rates rise again, mortgage rates go up to 7.25%, stay high through 24, along with inflation, unemployment rises and wages growth stalls due to recession, and rates then fall later, but migration drops away below average. So those are the 3 scenarios that I run. And if we then look at what happens, this is WA, you can see there that I'm forecasting, based on the scenarios, significant further price growth in Western Australia over the next 3 years on the best case scenario. On the base case, small rises, just 5.5% over 3 years. The worst case would be a fall, and we might see prices fall 15% over 3 years. Units travelling somewhat similarly, or not quite so dramatically, as you can see there. On the other hand, if you look at Tasmania, even the best case scenario, only very slight rises, 2.8% over 3 years. But on the base case, there's a fall, 16%, or a more significant fall if things go worse. Units, somewhat similar. If we look at Victoria, again, similar story, hardly any growth, 2.8% over 3 years. In the best case a fall, worst case a more significant fall. And so much the same with units, but not quite so significant. And if we look at young growing families as an example, as a segment, there is a small growth, 7.6% for those with properties that they're owning at the moment. That's the best case scenario. Base case, a fall of 11% or 32% if things go badly for houses. Units, similar, but not quite such a decent fall. In the worst case, 28% for units compared with 32% for houses. That gives you a bit of a flavour of what goes on. And I will just show you Queensland as well, just to give you a bit of a flavour, because Queensland is pretty strong in those 3 scenarios. On the other hand, units, not quite so much. But, you could be seeing 18% further rises in Queensland. And I think that's the point I want to make. Again, it's very variable based on the individual amounts of, people buying, how much they're borrowing, what their incomes are doing. So it is very important to understand how diverse the various parts of the country are. So What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch across and just show you a little bit of the stress data, but mapped, because I think it's quite interesting looking at some of the mapping. And the point about the mapping is that it allows us then to, get a bit of a feel for what's going on the ground. So let me switch that across. So this is the story for New South Wales, and particularly drilling into Sydney initially. Sydney, of course, is as I say, bubbling, but some stress. And as we pull out, we can see, as always, the more yellowy and orangey and reddy colours start to show in. But even close in, there are some pressurised points, Mossman, Bondi Beach, Randwick, and places like Zetland and Waterloo. But further out, we come out to North Strathfield and Concord, Ashfield, places like that, Canterbury. And then as we pull out further, we start to see the more significant, more red areas coming in. Not surprising given what we know. This is what I've been talking about. And the ring of fire continues to bubble away. So 2170, of course, is there, as you'd expect, in and around Liverpool, Campbelltown, up to the north as well, Blacktown, the Hills and North Ryde and places like that. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of what the story is. It's very patchworky, but to the west, it's more difficult from a count perspective. Now, if I then go to Victoria, do a similar thing, you can see there that in Victoria, we start again close in. Well, there are a few signs of some stress, but in the yellows rather than the reds. But as you pull out, you start to see the problems over in the west, in the Wyndham area. And as you pull out further, you start to see them also emerging to the north, 3064, and also, very importantly, beyond Dandenong. This area down here, between Frankstown and Cardinia, in that area there, some significant pressurised households now. And Ballarat's also showing there as well. If we pull out just slightly further, you can see that too. So regional areas like Ballarat, the areas to the west and to the east and to the north is where a lot of the stress lives. And unfortunately, the pressure on households continues to grow. Even down in places like Geelong, not quite such a high population count because the population density is lower, but there's issues there too. And if we were to switch across to look at Perth, I think Perth is quite interesting, particularly because of the strong prices growth that we've seen. And we can see once again that there are some pressurized points as we pull out further. North of the Central Business District, of course, Wanneroo, one that keeps popping up. And then south as well, if you go south, you can see that there are some pressurized points there. Again, it is in these sort of suburban areas where a lot of the issues are. Swan is a particular hotspot that I'm seeing, but the population density is not quite so high, but there are still some significant hotspots. And as you pull further out, even down towards Mandurah, there again, you can see the yellow. So that gives you a bit of a flavour there. And I will just do Brisbane. And that gives you a bit of a comparison. Brisbane, of course, not such high population density, but as we pull out, you can start to see the yellows begin to show. South Brisbane, Highgate Hill, up north, Stafford Heights. And then if you look at Camp Hill and places like that, they're also showing. And as we pull out further, you start seeing Ipswich come into view as well. Ipswich, of course, is a real hotspot, as we've shown earlier on. And if you go south down towards the Gold Coast, again, some pressure, not as much pressure from a population density perspective, but still a lot of people in some difficulty there. And a lot of people getting mortgages that are still remarkably high in the Brisbane area. Now, if I just then switch briefly to the rental stress, just open that. And I can give you just a quick tour of the rental stress, and we'll start within Sydney again. And closer in, there's more rental stress. A lot of the rents close into the city are really high now relative to incomes, and that's putting a lot of pressure. So you can see that there are more yellows closer in than we saw, and some oranges. But again, if you go west, you start to see the same pressures, Liverpool, Parramatta, and up north as well. So Blacktown. So that's pretty much the same story, where you've got a lot of pressure in the rental sector. And if we went to Victoria, again, a lot of pressure there as well, not surprisingly. And in fact, close in, centre of town, it's a red, as I showed you earlier on, pulling out. Richmond South Bank, a lot of people paying a lot to live in those high-rise developments, often probably rather cheaply built in the first place. And as you pull out, you start to see then more of the Wyndham area coming in again, as well as beyond Dandenong. And so it goes on. So, there is some interesting correlations between rental stress and mortgage stress as well, as you can see. So I think that's probably enough at the moment. We might come back and do some more depending on what you'd like to talk about. But I'm going now to look back over the chat and also just answer a couple of queries that I had earlier on, because I have had some people say, "Hey, what about this postcode?" And that's a good way to get into what we're actually looking at. So I'm going to switch over to the screen and go to slides. There you go. So this is now the definitive detailed information coming out of our model. And I always use Wollongong because I know that very well. Postcode 2500. But just to take you quickly around, we have some information about the household mix. So how many own outright, how many are borrowing, and how many are renting. And you can see here that we've got 49% renting, 23% borrowing, and 27% owning outright in this particular postcode. We've got information on stress based on my definition. So 46% in mortgage stress, 77% in rental stress, some stressed investors, the aggregate financial stress at 57%. And then you've got the information about the types of property, 35% of houses, 52% of units, 11% of other types. That can include property over retail or other types of property, even, I guess, caravans or other cabins, those sorts of things. We've got information about the people ratio, which is how many people per property. So the higher gives you an indication of households with families. The vacancy rate, that's based on the census data. A bit out of date now, but it's the latest we've got. Gross investment yield, which is effectively from an investment perspective, the comparison of the rental take that you can get, assuming it's fully let, compared with the price of the property currently. Net investment yield, which is the more realistic, what happens after you've paid for the mortgage, you've paid for the management of the property, etc., repairs and everything else. So are you going backwards or not? Here, of course, the net investment yield is negative. So people are losing money in this postcode on average in investment properties on a cash flow basis. And then we've got the taxable income from the ATO, 79,000 versus 84,000 per household from the census. And then it takes us up to the disposable monthly income, which says 43% on average going to pay the typical mortgage of $2,400 and 35% going on the typical rent. And that's $1,993. So that's the typical story that we get. And then we also got the scenarios, again, plus 12 months, plus 24, plus 36 months. And it shows you the story with regard to the movements and what may happen. And not surprisingly, if things go really well, there's still some price growth. But if things go a bit pear-shaped, the base case is a fall and a more significant fall, down 30% in the worst case scenario, as we discussed. And houses and units performing a little bit differently. So it's all information. All that information is available. Now, if you want a particular postcode that you'd like me to go through on the show tonight, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'll try and get to it. Alternatively, if you don't have a chance to do that tonight, but you'd still like this snapshot for a particular postcode, you can also contact me via the DFA blog. Send me a message and I'll happily send you the one page. Or if you want the whole set of data, it is available. You can subscribe via our Patreon program, and I'll touch on that towards the end of the show. Anyway, Mitch asked for a couple of postcodes before the show started. He asked for 6330, which was Albany. And so we'll give you the story on Albany, Mitch. So here is 15,000 households with 38% owning outright, 30% borrowing, 26% renting. You can see there that mortgage stress is at 35%, but rental stress is at 68%, so that's pretty high. Overall financial stress, not too bad at 33%. Mostly houses, 90%. Some units and other types of property there too. People ratio is just over 2, so that would suggest that we've got some people with possibly families too, but also some individuals. The vacancy rate was quite high at 13% back in census time. Gross investment yield is 4.2, net investment yield is 0.8. The average taxable, about 70,000 based on the two information sets we have, both household and census. And that gives a disposal monthly of around $4,300 with 41% going on the typical borrowing and 34% going on the typical rent. Mortgage payment, $1,820 or rental, $1,495 on average. And just looking at the scenarios, still price growth in the best case scenario up 22%. The base case would be for houses a small rise of 2.8% over 3 years. The worst case would be a fall of 17%. Units performing pretty similarly, but perhaps slightly less so. Now, the other one that Mitch asked for was 6280. Okay, 6280. So this is Bustleton in the Bunbury area. And there we've got 12,200 households with 37% owning outright. And borrowing 37%, renting 25%. And looking at the mortgage stress data, 26.9% in mortgage stress, 43% in rental stress, but overall financial stress 24%. 87% are actually houses, small number of other types of property. People ratios 1.96 are a little lower, so perhaps some sole occupants. 17.2% vacant, so that could well be some second homes and holiday homes and Airbnbs. Gross investment yield is 4, net investment yield is plus 0.3%. Average taxable, 75,000 versus the income household, 71, giving disposal monthly of around 4,500, with 45.7% going on the typical mortgage at $2,080 and 38.3% at 1,745 going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, up 26% best case scenario, base case up 7, worst case down 13 for houses, and slightly less for units. So I hope that made some sense, Mitch. Now, Tony Lacantro, thank you very much for the super chat. And you've asked for 6060. So welcome, Tony. Nice to see you on. Can't remember whether you're on holiday yet or whether you're going on holiday soon, but I think maybe soon. So this is 6060. And this is Yokain, and I always have difficulty with these June Darina. Yeah, something like that. In sterling. Okay, 12,000 households, 24% own outright, 32% of borrowing, 42% of renting, so a lot of renters there. Mortgage stress 71%, renting stress at 87%, stress investors at 19%, and 65% overall financial stress. 37% houses, 15% of units, and 47% of other types of property. This is interesting. And the people ratio is quite low, 1.88, so probably some sole occupiers there as well as families. Vacancy rate was 8.6%. Gross investment yield is 3.7, net investment yield is 0.2. Average taxable income, 79,000 from the ATO and 85,000 from the census, giving a disposal monthly of just over 5,700, with 38% going on the mortgage, 2,210 on average, or 28.2%, 1,610 going on the average rent. And looking at the scenarios, up 14% over the next 3 years. Best case down 5, worst case 26 for houses. Units 12, down 4.6 and down 22.7. So I hope that makes some sense, Tim. I'm just going to take the chat off so that you can just see the last piece of the puzzle there. There you go, 3.7 and 0.2. Okay, let me just go back up and have a look at some of the other questions and what have you and see what we've got. Jason made the point about Victoria. Let me just put that one up. That's quite good, actually. Any growth in Victoria will be countered by new taxes to pay the interest off the massive debt. Yeah, the Victorian economy is pretty significantly off. And of course, they're talking about doing all sorts of things. The latest, I believe, is to give out some more money to people, as just announced in the budget. So it's really crazy what's going on there, and not too surprising that we're seeing some significant issues. Now, Bossman asked if I could do 4305, which I can do, absolutely. Go back to the slides, 4305. Now, this is Basin Pocket in the Ipswich area. And there we've got 25,000 households with 6,500 or 25% owning outright, 34% borrowing and 39% renting. Mortgage stress is at 75%, rental stress is at 84%, 20% in stressed investors, giving overall financial stress 62%. I'll make the point, this financial stress drives into the scenarios in terms of price movement. So as you'd expect, as financial stress rises, the trajectory of prices are actually less significantly higher. 86% of houses, some units as well. The people ratio is 2.33, so that'll be some families as well as individuals. Vacancy rate 6.9% on census night. Gross investment yields 4.2. Let's get so you can see that. Net investment yield 0.1. The taxable income 67,000 or 73,000 on the household, and that will give a disposal monthly income around 4,936 or 33%, so a third going on the mortgage, 1,664, and 30%, 1,495 going on the typical rent. And I'll just make the point that where you see the household number significantly higher than the census number, that shows you that multiple incomes are supporting the mortgage. So here, only slightly, but in others, perhaps more so. So Cookie Boys asked for postcode 2291. So we've got in the Newcastle area, Merriweather and the Junction. 5,800 there with 36% owning outright, 31% borrowing, 31% renting, and mortgage stress at 70%, so that's quite high, 30% in rental stress, some stressed investors, overall financial stress 37%. You can see there that 63% are houses, 70% are units, but also some other types of property too. And the people ratio is 2.28, I should say. Some vacancy rate, 7.9, that's quite high. 3.2% gross investment yield, net investment yield minus 0.2%. I just want to underscore, this is the one to look at. If you're thinking about investing in property, forget the gross investment yield, it tells you nothing. The net investment yield, the real cash flow, is the important one. Where it's negative, you're losing money on a cash flow basis. And of course, if you're seeing significant capital appreciation, you might still want to invest, but nevertheless, net investment yield is pretty important. Now, if you look at the taxable, 113 versus 119, and that translates to a disposal monthly of around 7,945, with 37% going on the mortgage, $3,000, 27%, 2,142, going on typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, you can see there that the best case for houses is a further rise, maybe 14.5% over 3 years. Base case, a fall of about 5%. Worst case is a more significant fall. Houses working more strongly than units, but units up 12.5 or down 22.3% over the next 3 years based on my scenarios. Remember, it's not a forecast, it's just a scenario. Really, really important to understand that. Now, Archie asked for postcode 3825. Can do that. And there we're seeing a postcode called Mo. Is it Moe or is it Mo? I'm not sure, depending on how you pronounce it. This is in the South Gippsland area. 9,200 households with 40% earning outright, 32% borrowing, 27% renting, 37.5% in mortgage stress, 75% in rental stress. We've got some stressed investors and 38% in financial stress overall. Looking at the houses, 86%, small number of units, no types of property. The people ratio is 1.96, so a little lower than some, maybe some sole occupiers there. Quite high vacancies, possibly some second homes or Airbnb. Gross investment yield is 3.2. Net investment yield is minus 0.3%. Looking at the taxable income, 69,000 from the ATO, 55,000 from the census. It gives a disposal monthly of 3,674, and 35% is going on the average mortgage, 1,300, and 29.2% is going on the typical rent at 1,072. Now, because of the significant pressures, we're seeing there that even in the best case scenario in this particular area, there isn't much capital growth likely to happen over the next 3 years. Very small. Over the next 12 months, maybe 1.1, but then nothing much over the next 2 years. That's in the best case. And houses and units performing somewhat similarly. The base case will be a fall of about 19% over 3 years and 39% worst case scenario. So let's hope the worst case scenario doesn't play out. And units somewhat similar. So you can see there that in the Melbourne and Victorian area in particular, there's a really, really big issue there in terms of the problems going on. Mitch, I just want to say thank you very much for your super chat. Really appreciate that, and glad I could help you with that information. Always happy to share my information with you and give you a bit of a sense of what's going on. I'm afraid the areas south of Perth, are all over the place at the moment, so very important to look quite closely. And another super chat there, postcode 4567 Noosa. Mate lives there and would like to buy, but probably no chance unless he wins the lottery. Yeah, well, Noosa's always an interesting one, so let's put that one up for you and see what we can find. Let me just put the number in, 4567. And then I'll cut across to it. And I'll take the super chat off so you can see it. Thank you very much for the super chat. Always appreciate it. And so this is Noosa and Noosa Heads, Sunrise Beach, Sunshine Beach. Nice area, actually. Always like it when I go there. About 5,000 households, 43% earn outright. A lot of old money up there, of course. 30% of borrowing and 26% of renting. 35% in mortgage stress, 7% in rental stress, 31% in investor stress, and overall the financial stress is 46%, 68% of houses, 15% of units, 16% of other types, and that could be all sorts of different types of property, of course, including cabins and those sorts of things. 1.62 is, so it's on the low side of the people ratio, so probably some individuals as well as families. And the vacancy rate, obviously very high because there's a lot of second homes, Airbnb, et cetera, there as well. Gross investment yield is 4.7. Net investment yield is positive, 0.7%. The average taxable reported around 95,000, the same as the census. And that gives a disposal monthly of 5,676, giving 45% going on the typical mortgage, 2,600, and 45.2% at 2,567 going on the typical rent. So rents are extremely high there, of course. And looking at the scenarios, 13% growth over 3 years for houses, best case. Fall of 6.6% base case. Fall of 27% worst case. Units up 11 or down 23% over the next 3 years based on what happens. So there we go. Hope that's somewhat. And you say Noosa mortgage stress surprisingly higher than expected. Yeah, and I think that's simply because the price values are very high there, and therefore the mortgages are big. And there are some people, of course, with significant capacity to borrow. One of the reasons why things are where they are. But, if you look at it compared with some other areas, it's actually not as high as I've seen elsewhere. And thank you for my pronunciation, less than hammers. June Danar. June Danar. Yeah. So still learning how to. There are so many lovely places to pronounce in Australia. I don't always get them right. I apologize for that. But hey, I'll do my best. So thank you for the coaching. Keep up the good work. All right, let's see what else we can find in terms of other questions. Okay, here's one. Dome Pop. Let's put the slide back up. 3976. So this is Hampton Park in Melbourne, and it's in the Latrobe seat. So we've got 8,300 households, 23% own outright, but 47% are borrowing, very high mortgage belt there, 29% are renting. And we've got 29% in mortgage stress, but 100% in rental stress. Now, just be careful. 100% is plus or minus a few, but, a lot of people in difficulty. Overall financial stress, 53%. 92% of houses, small number of units on the types of property. People ratio is really high. So a lot of families in this area, whereas the vacancy rate is very low. So it's a very stable environment there. Gross investment yield is 3.5%. Net investment yield is minus 0.5%, so another loss, I'm afraid. And this is really significant here. You can see perhaps there that the taxable income is 59,000, but the household census was 79,000. So multiple incomes going in there to pay the mortgage, giving a disposable monthly of around $4,600, with 41% going on the mortgage at $1,900 and 37.7% at $1,749 going on the typical rent. Very, very high stress levels, as you would perhaps expect, particularly in the rental sector there. And looking at the cumulative movements, best case scenario, a bit of a fall, 3%, slightly less for units. Base case, a fall of 22%. And the worst case, a fall of 43%. So very sensitive to further interest rate rises and defaults and those things in this area, as you'd expect. And I keep highlighting, it's really important to understand this, that a lot of the pressures on households are amongst those in the lower cohorts in terms of income, but are very highly leveraged up. Okay, let's find another one. Otto asks for Albaville. 2204. I hope that isn't it's Marrickville. Now I understand why it was Albaville. Very good. Yes. Okay, I like it. Okay, 11,200 households in this one, with 23% earning outright, 28% borrowing, and 48% are renting. 25.6% in mortgage stress, 88% in rental stress. Ooch, look at the stressed investors at 49%, giving financial stress 63%. So a lot of investors are up the creek without a paddle. 32% are houses, but most are units, 47%, plus other types of property. Vacancy rate at 9%. Now, some of that could be that the census was done when, of course, some students were still overseas because of COVID. People ratio is above 2, but the gross investment yield is at 3.3. Net investment yield is minus 0.4%. And looking at the taxable income, 89,000 versus the census income at 112. So again, multiple incomes going on the mortgage, giving a disposable monthly around 7,000, with 43.5% going on the typical mortgage at just over $3,100, and the rent, 33% going at $2,300 a month on the average rent. And looking at the scenarios, best case scenario, rise of 8% over the next 3 years. Base case, a fall of 11%. Worst case, a fall of 32%. Units falling not quite as much, or rising not quite as much. Tends to be the case with units, as you've seen in the charts already. Okay. Heath asks 3414. 341. Sorry. 3714. Put the right number to start. We'll get on better. Now, I must highlight that this is actually a very low count reading. And so when the low count warning comes up, don't take these too seriously, because with a 0.5% sample rate, we only have a small number in the sample. Nevertheless, 1695 households with 52% owning outright, 29% borrowing, and 18% renting. Some mortgage stress, 74%, a lot of rental stress, and overall financial stress of 40%. 91% of houses, small number of other types of property. People ratio is 1.8, so some individuals perhaps as well as some families, but high vacancy at 16.8%. Gross investment yield is 2.7, net investment yield is minus 2.3%. Now that may have something to do with the sampling size, or it may simply be the ability to be able to let out, I'm not sure. Gross investment, the average taxable 68 versus 60, and that gives a disposal monthly around just over $4,000, with 39% going on the typical mortgage, or 30% going on the typical rent. So average mortgage 1,589, average rent 1,245. And looking at the scenarios, I'm afraid falls across the board. The best case is a fall of 4% over 3 years. Base case 23%, worst case 44%. Units following a similar trend. Okay, we have another question coming in. This is 4505. Okay, so this one is in the Moreton Bay area, and it's Burpengari. Well, that's my best guess anyway. Okay, 9,600 households, 30% owning outright, 42% of borrowing, and 26% of renting. And that gives us 86% in mortgage stress, 91% in rental stress. Ouch. Some investor stress, overall financial stress, 67%. That's high. 86% of houses, some types of units and other types of property in the area. People ratios on the high side, so some families there, I think. Low vacancy rate, 3.8%. Gross investment yields, 4.4. Net investment yield is minus 0.1%. And looking at the average taxable, 69,000 versus 91,000 for the census, giving, again, a clue that we're seeing multiple incomes going to feed the mortgage. Disposable monthly income's around $5,500, with 39.2% going on the typical mortgage at $2,184, and 32% going on the typical rent at $1,794. And looking at the scenarios, positive 7.6% over 3 years, best case down 12%. Base case down 33%. Worst case, units following a similar trend, but not quite so severely. Okay, what else have we got? Leo asks for Coburg 3058. So I have to say some of these Victorian postcodes are looking quite worrisome at the moment. 14,100 households, 31% own outright, 34% are borrowing, 33% are renting, 24% in mortgage stress, 80% in rental stress, stressed investors 29% and 45% overall there as the financial stress measure. 67% are houses and 8.9% are units. There are some other types of property there too. People ratio is 2.29 and the vacancy rate was 8.3%. 3.3% is the gross investment yield, minus 0.5% is net investment yield. Unfortunately, a lot of the investment yields in Victoria are negative at the moment. And looking at the taxable income, 80,000 versus 106. So once again, multiple incomes going to support the mortgage, giving a disposable monthly of around $6,500, or 40% going on the rent. On the mortgage, $2,600. On the rent, 32%, or $2,098 on average. And looking at the scenarios, best case scenario with a very small rise of 0.3% over 3 years. Base case down 19%, worst case down 39%, and units performing somewhat similarly to what we'd expect. Ben Chesterman asks for 2120. Okay, 2120. This is Pennant Hills in Sydney. And must remember to take the gross and net investment yield cover off for you, Ben, because you can't see it there. I'll do it in a second. Okay, 7,500 households, 36% owning outright, 42% are borrowing, 20% are renting, 41% in mortgage stress, more than 2,000. They're 73% in rental stress, some investor stress, and financial stress at 51%. Looking at the count there, 79% are houses, 8.8% are units, and 11% other types of property. We've got a people ratio of 2.74%, so families, I suspect, in there. Gross and net investment yield, get rid of that. 3.4% on the gross and minus 0.8% in net investment yield. And I'll show you the vacancy rates at 4.6% there. Average taxable, 99,000. Household census, 137,000. So once again, multiple incomes going on that mortgage, giving a disposal monthly around 7,400 with 45% going on the typical mortgage, 3,380. And the typical rental payment, 34% at 2,591. Scenarios are, well, there is some growth. Best case, 7.9% over 3 years. Base case, down 11. Worst case, down 32. And units a little bit less significant. So Bloom. What about Heidelberg and Maidenstone? So 3081. Bang that in. There we go. Heidelberg West, etc. 5,900 households with 20% owning outright, 31% borrowing, 48% renting, 84% in mortgage stress. So again, mortgage stress is very high, 76% in rental stress, some stressed investors too, giving overall financial stress at 69%. The household mix is houses 61%, units 2.9%, other types of property 35%, and looking at the people ratio, it's 2.1. The vacancy rate at 10.7 was on the high side, but again, that could be some student accommodation vacant at the time. Who knows? Gross investment yields 3.1, net investment yield is minus 0.6. So again, losing money on a cash flow basis. 71% versus 83% for the taxable income. Possibly again, multiple income supporting the mortgage. Average monthly income around $5,700 with 43.5% going on the mortgage. 2,496 versus 30.5% at 1,749 going on the typical rent. Property scenarios down 5.3 best case, base case 24, worst case 45. So probably a horrible scenario there. And units somewhat similar. Let me just take that off so you can see the gross net investment yield, because I forgot to take it off earlier on. My apologies. Okay, 3032. Okay, 3032. And there we've got Ascot Vale, High Point City, etc. 12,800 households, 25% owning outright, 34% borrowing, 40% renting, 25% in mortgage stress, 80% in rental stress, 25% in stressed investors, and 51.9% in financial stress. 38% to houses, 36% to units, and the types of property there as well. People ratio is 2.06, vacancy rates 12.1. I suspect, again, this could be an area where maybe students are actually usually there but weren't because of the COVID issue and the census when it was done. Gross investment yield 3.2, net investment yield minus 0.6. So once again, a negative net investment yield. A lot of Victorian properties are like that at the moment. One reason why a lot of investors are selling. 90,080, 106 from the census. Again, multiple incomes going on the mortgage. Disposal monthly is around 6,800 with 38.1 going on the mortgage repayment, $2,600, and 27.8% at 1,899 going on the typical rent. Scenarios, minus 0.7% best case scenario, minus 20 base case, minus 41 worst case over 3 years, and the units following a similar trend. Okay, let's see what else we've got in the okay. See what else? What else? Glenwood. 4579. Thank you very much for the super chat. It is greatly appreciated. So this is Martha Mountain. And here we have 18,500 households with 41% owning outright, 36% borrowing, and 22% renting. And you can see there that the disposable income is on the low side, but we'll work through that and work out why that's the case. 36% in mortgage stress, 89% in rental stress, and overall financial stress at 46%. 92% houses, so mostly houses. 2.22, so probably some families there as well. Vacancy rate's quite high at 9.1, so possibly these are second homes and Airbnbs and things there as well. Gross investment yield is 4.7. Net investment yield is 0.4% positive. I've just taken you off so you can see that. And looking at the average taxable, 64,000 versus 60 for the household. So the taxable income is relatively low, which gives you the low disposable monthly income, which means that 41% is going on the typical mortgage at 1,560 and 39% going on typical rent at 1,470. I'm afraid that my eyes water when I see these sorts of proportions. That's really, really high. And no wonder people are under pressure, which is why the stress, particularly rental stress, is so high. Scenarios are 12% rise, best case scenario over 3 years for houses, down 6.8% base case and down 27.8% worst case. Units following trend just slightly lower. And many thanks for this super chat as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate they all are very, 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 very appreciated because believe me, there's a lot of costs involved in just keeping this show on the road, not least because of all the gear I have and everything else that I need to make it run. So it is greatly appreciated. And you actually asked then for postcode 2612. So let's give you that one. (2612) is Reed in the ACT. First time we've looked at Canberra tonight. 8,600 households, 18% own outright, 28% are borrowing, but 53% are renting. 32% in mortgage stress, 92% of households in rental stress, a lot of investor stress too, and 65% of households overall in financial stress. 20% of houses, but most of them are units. 65% plus other types of property. People ratio is lower, so that includes a lot of individuals as well as some families. The vacancy rate was quite high at 14.9%, possibly again, might be student related because of this when the census was run. Gross investment yield is 4.2, net investment yield is 0.6. Average taxable, 99,000. Household census, 123,000. So probably multiple incomes going on to support the mortgage because the disposable monthly income is quite high, 7,948, with 30% going on the mortgage and 30.7 going on the typical rent at 2,441. I'll make the point that the average income for many people in the ACT is quite a lot higher, and that's why we're seeing some quite different trends there. Although, interestingly, scenarios suggest that the price movements are sideways or down. Even in the best case scenario, it's only 2% up over 3 years, or down 17.4% or 38% of houses and units, where of course most of them are units, down up 1.7%, down 15%, and down 32%. So shows you, I think, that the story is there. Some pressure building, definitely some pressure building. Okay, Drew asked for 3070. Hi Drew, good to see you on. Okay, so this is Northcote, 10,800 households and 30% owning outright, 31% borrowing, 38% renting. Mortgage stress, 34% at more than 1,500 households there struggling, 71% with rental stress, 31% in stressed as Vesterland, and 51.2% in overall financial stress. That's quite high. 49% of houses, 22% of units, and 28% other types of property. People ratio is 2.11, and the vacancy rates 9.2% with 3.3% gross investment yield and minus 0.7% net investment yield. The taxable was 100,000. The household census 118,000. So again, multiple incomes, I suspect, going to feed that mortgage. Disposable monthly 7,374 with 39% going on the typical mortgage and 32% going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, best case a fall of 1% or so over the next 3 years. Base case down 20, worst case down 40. Units not quite so much. $4,505, not wanting to invest there. Let's have a look, shall we? 4,505. 4,505. Okay. So here we've got 9,600 households with 30% owning outright, 42% borrowing, and 26% renting. We have 86% in mortgage stress, 91% in rental stress, overall financial stress 67%. Mostly houses, but some units there as well and other types of property. People ratios on the higher side, 2.61, and the gross investment yield is 4.4, but the net investment yield is minus 0.1%. Interestingly, that's unusual for Queensland, so you made a good call there, I think, about not investing maybe. Looking at the ATO, 69,000 compared with the census, 91,000. So again, multiple incomes feeding the mortgage. Monthly disposable is about $5,500 with 39% or $2,184 going on the typical mortgage and 32% or $1,794 going on the typical rent. Scenarios are, well, a bit of a rise, 7.6% over 3 years, base case down 12, worst case down 33, and units a little less severe, the fall or rise, but similar trends to elsewhere that we've seen. Okay, can I keep the Melbourne theme going? 3151, you sure can. I'm going to run out of time soon, so want me to do all of this. Is Burwood East. And 4262 households there with 43% owning outright, 29% borrowing, 26% of renting. The stress levels are 61% and 66% for mortgage and rental stress, and overall financial stress 45%. Houses 73%, small number of units and other types of property. The people ratio was 2.36% and the vacancy rate was 8%. Gross investment yield is 3.2%. Net investment yield again minus 0.4%. Taxable 75,000, census 83,000, giving a disposal monthly around $5,200 with 49% going on a typical mortgage to 576 and 41.9% to 187 going on the typical rent payment. And looking at the scenarios, a fall of 2.1% best case, 21% base case, 42% worst case, and units following suit. Okay, Mr. LB asks for 3204. 3204. Interesting, a lot of Melbourne interest tonight. So this is Bentley in the Glen Eira area. 13,000 households, 31% owning outright, 35% of borrowing and 32% of renting. We have 75% in mortgage stress, 72% in rental stress, and overall financial stress 52%. We have 56% of houses, some units and other types of property. The people ratio is 2.37, so some families there. Vacancy was 8.2. Gross investment yields 3. Net investment yield minus 0.1%. Average taxable 97,000 versus 116,000, so probably multiple incomes going to support the mortgage. Disposal monthly 7571, and that gives 39% going on the typical mortgage of just over $3,000 there, and the rent 30%, 2298. And looking at the scenarios, down 2%, 21%, and 41% for the best, base, and worst case scenarios. And once again, the units are following somewhat similar stories. Okay. And Jason, thank you very much for your super chat there. Really appreciate it. As always, appreciate the super chat, but also appreciate the comments and conversation tonight as well. Very important conversation this, I'm afraid. And, the story is that a lot of it is pretty uncomfortable for many people. So hopefully I can share some of the information there and help people out. So thank you very much, Jason. As always, really appreciate it. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to do VJ asks for Cheltenham. Now this is Cheltenham in Victoria. Let me just go back to the screen there. Okay, so this is 10,000 households with 33% earning outright, 39% borrowing and 27% renting. We have 26% in mortgage stress, 87% in rental stress, overall financial stress of 47%, 58% in houses, 18% in units and other types of property, 23%, 2.24, so I guess some households there. And looking at the vacancy rate, 7%, 3.4% gross investment yield, down to minus 0.5% net investment yield. Average taxable 86 versus 99 for the census, and gives a disposal monthly of around $6,000, with 43% going on the typical mortgage and 35% going on the typical rent. And the scenarios are best case down 1.6, base case down 21% over 3 years, and 41% over 3 years for the worst case scenario, and units following somewhat similar suit. And you also asked for the Malvern 3144, so let me just put that one in as well. This is another Victorian postcode, of course, 4,500 there, with 42% earning outright, 29% borrowing, 27% renting, 21% in mortgage stress, 80% in rental stress, and overall financial stress is pretty high at 42%. 45% houses, 31% units, other types of property, 22%. Just over 2 on the people ratio, 13.7, so some vacancies there, perhaps again students missing at the time of the census. 3.3% gross investment yield, but minus 0.4% net investment yield. Average taxable, 172,000, so one of the higher incomes. But the household was 138, so a bit of variation there. Gives a disposal monthly of 7547, with a massive 50.9%, I think it's high as we've seen tonight, 50.9% going on the typical mortgage at 3840, and 29.8% at 2247 going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, down 1.4, best case, base case 20% down, and worst case down 41%, and units following suit. Okay, and I think I can just squeeze in Bossman, who asked for 4715. This will be the last one. So this is Castle Creek and a few other areas, Prospect, etc., etc. Okay, just as 2,566 there, with 28 owning outright, 35 borrowing, and 36% renting, 33 1/3 in mortgage stress, 77 2/3 in rental stress, overall financial stress 44%, mostly houses 90%, small number of other types of property there. Again, families 2.14%, high vacancy rates 14.8%, gross investment yields 4.6, net investment yield is positive 0.3, average taxable 85 versus 99, gives a disposal monthly around 6,200, and scenarios 16% best case scenario, down 3%, base case scenario for houses, worst case down 23%. Okay, so I think that'll do me for looking at the details there. Let me just switch back to the other slide show that I've got here, and we'll just round out the conversation a bit tonight. I think it's worth sort of saying that the story, of course, is always difficult for many people at the moment. And one of the things I always want to highlight as I come towards the end of the show is that if you are actually in financial difficulty, it's important to try and get the right sort of help. Obviously, the first thing you do is try and understand where the money is coming in and where it's going out to. So cash flows, those sort of things are really important. I still find many people in my surveys don't actually know where the money's going, and that's a worry. So first, build a cash flow so you understand where the money is. Then you can prioritize and look at dialing back where you can. Often I see people dialing back on things that probably aren't the most imperatives. Significantly high interest rate loans are the things to try and get rid of first. I've seen some people sort of pay off mortgages rather than actually pay down high interest, on credit cards or other personal loans. Pay down the high interest rate loans first. But then my other point is this: sometimes it's really important to get some external help, and don't just Google financial help on YouTube. You're going to actually potentially get lured into areas where you're going to get asked to pay for help. And unfortunately, they don't offer some good advice, but you can get good advice. And I always talk about here the debt helpline, the national debt helpline, 1-800-007-007. This is a government-backed and funded facility. They are very, very busy. They've got 4 times the calls they used to have. But nevertheless, they are worth talking to. They can help sort stuff out and help some prioritization, which is really important. The other source that I found recently, which I mentioned last time, I mentioned again, that AFCA have actually got a statement of financial position facility, which allows you to put in all sorts of information, your details, your income, your living expenses, the property details, other assets, the debts, and also, how you're going to deal with it. This is a really good template for being able to put together before you go and talk to your lender. The reason I say this is because, unfortunately, some people, when they go to the lenders, are actually offered solutions that are good for the lenders but not good for the borrower. And, you're ending up paying a lot more interest for a lot longer. But this is a good facility to be able to really help. And by the way, it also means if you don't get the right help, you've then got the facility to go and actually raise a complaint with AFCA. And I'll remind you again that if you are in financial hardship, banks do have a legal obligation to try and assist. What they are doing quite often is actually encouraging people to sell to get out. And that's one of the reasons why it's the case that the delinquency rates are still quite low, although rising, as we saw earlier on, because if the bank can encourage somebody to sell and get out, it means that there's enough money then to repay the bank. And I sometimes worry that that advice is being provided rather heavy-handedly to some people. So it's worth doing your homework and getting yourself sorted out and understanding your cash flows, etc., etc. Now, if you want more information about what I do and what I'm up to, you can, of course, go to the DFA blog. That's where you can send a message to me. If you go down on the blog, you can see there's a little button that says send a message or contact me. I put all my posts up there as well, so look at that. I've also got my Patreon program, and I do thank all those who support me via Patreon. It's greatly appreciated. It helps me to be able to do the things I do. And specifically, if you're interested in getting the information about the data that I've shared, but across the whole of the postcode base, about 2,000 postcodes plus, you can subscribe to get that. It's $50 US plus GST a month, and you can join for as long as you like. You can join for a month just to get the data set once, or you can join and get the update every month. I'll be sending it out tomorrow for those on the Patreon program already on this tier. So very, very important source of information there. And that information is available for all of the major postcodes across Australia. It's updated every month. I've also got to the ability, if you'd like to contribute via Patreon, you can do that, by PayPal, you can do that as a one-off as well. And again, all contributions greatly received just to help cover some of the costs of what I do here. There's quite a lot involved in doing all of this, and it is really appreciated. The only reason I can keep doing it is because of the support I get from the community. So once again, many thanks. And by the way, I also take Bitcoin if in fact Bitcoin is something that you feel that you'd like to throw in my direction, always greatly appreciated. Anyway, that takes us pretty much to the end of the show. I want to say thank you very much for spending so much of your time with us this evening. It is very, very significant and important time in many people's households. We have to expect that rates will stay high for longer. We have to expect there is still a risk that rates could go higher still. That means that more households are going to get caught in the net of pressure here. Real incomes are still going backwards for many people, and the RBA is still signaling they don't know where rates are going to go. So that's why it's important for individuals to try and take a lot of initiative themselves to try and manage their households. Anyway, thank you very much for spending some time with us. Just to say that next week, Damien Clason will be on, and we're going to be looking at the markets in more detail. That'll of course be budget night, so we'll try and perhaps follow the budget at the same time, depending on that, how that goes. And then the week after that, I've got Edwin coming on the Tuesday evening live to talk specifically about how you prepare your property if you were thinking about putting on the market, because there are some very important things to talk about there. And then a couple of weeks later, Steve Keane is coming back on to talk about some of the broader economic themes and variations. And there'll be some other people on as well. So that's the program for the next few weeks. And just before I duck off, I'll just show you the doggies that are still there. They've hardly moved, made no noise at all. Luckily, the garbage collectors came before I got into my serious show, so that was good. And hopefully they'll stay there and just sleep for the last few minutes of the show, and then I'll take them up for another walk and then do the rest of the day. So thank you very much indeed for spending some time with us. Thanks also for those new people who've contributed to the show here tonight, making comments in the chat, as well as dropping in. Really appreciate your time. Do drop back for another live show every Tuesday. We do them, but we also do weekly shows on a sort of revolving basis with a range of different people, but also on a daily basis. We also post shows up to YouTube as well. And the interesting observation there is we're getting quite a lot of new viewers looking at those. We're also doing now some shorts as well, and those shorts are bringing some further new people in as well. So we'll be continuing to do that. Anyway, thank you very much for spending some time with us. Take care. Have a good evening. Watch your finances, and I'll look forward to seeing you the next time. This is Martin North from Digital Science Analytics. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.